Okay, let's go ahead and get started this morning. Welcome to the 2020 High Desert Real Estate Symposium virtual edition. I want to thank my team who has worked very hard to transition this symposium to a Zoom meeting format. Thank you very much. Also, I want to give a big thank you to all of our sponsors who signed up early and also supported us through this process. Our gold sponsors, Armstrong Fairway Insurance Agency, Casey Armstrong, thank you very much. City of Victorville, Desert Community Bank Mortgage Advisors, Midway Home Solutions. Our silver sponsors, Alaska USA Federal Credit Union, the City of Barstow, the City of Hesperia, CoStar, Desert Valley Medical Group, Enterprise Funding, Mojave Printing Solutions, Mortgage Solutions Financial, Sterling Development, First District Supervisor Robert Lovingood, and the Town of Apple Valley. And also a big thank you to our bronze sponsors, the Law Office of Caldwell, Kennedy, and Porter, AV Communications, Citizens Business Bank, and IPX 1031 Exchanges. So we've got an interesting lineup for the following 3 Thursdays. We're going to be doing this every Thursday at 9 a.m. Next Thursday, we have Ben Porritt from Express West High-Speed Rail. He's Vice President of Corporate Affairs. He's going to be talking about the high-speed rail project between Apple Valley, California, and Las Vegas. On the 21st, we have the City Manager panel. We're going to have Doug Robertson from the Town of Apple Valley, Nikki Solis from the City of Barstow, Nils Benson from the City of Hesperia, Keith Metzler from the City of Victorville, and Jesse Flores from the City of Adelanto, again next Thursday at 9 a.m. And actually, that's the 21st, the 2 Thursdays from now. And on May 28th, 9 a.m., the State of High Desert Commercial Real Estate, which will include myself, Bob Basin, Executive Vice President with Coldwell Banker Commercial, Terry Sines, Coldwell Banker Commercial, and also Jared Schindel, Vice President, Coldwell Banker Commercial. And then we'll also have a housing market historical review and forecast from Chris Lamoureux, Coldwell Banker Home Source. So with that, let me go ahead and get started and introduce our guest today, Dr. John Husing. Many of you have known him, seen him. Dr. Husing is a research economist who specialized in the study of Southern California's growing economy since 1964. For decades, he has produced city and county-specific economic development strategies for the region's local government. Dr. Husing's extensive study of the region has led to economic strategies that combine analytical work with extensive interviews with executives and entrepreneurs to understand the forces shaping Southern California. His firm, Economics and Politics, Inc., based in Redlands, California, has produced project-specific economic impact studies for transportation and water agencies, housing developers, environmental entities, and the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. In 2007, the Los Angeles Times listed him as one of the 100 people wielding the most influence in Southern California. Dr. John Husing was kind enough to record an economic update from his home. Like many of us, he's been quarantined at his house, and we sent a video crew down to spend a morning with him just 2 days ago. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and get the video started.
Hi, I'm economist John Husing, and what I'm going to be doing is giving you a revised forecast on what I anticipate happening through the entire year 2020, including the 3 months that have already occurred, plus looking at what the full result will be once the 8 months to come are done. You'll notice on the screen I have the arrow pointing at fear, because I think that's basically the public's attitude as to where we are right now. Now, I always like to start my work off with a confession of what I said would occur a year ago and what in fact did happen. I said I thought we'd create 38,200 jobs, have a growth rate of 2.5%, and unemployment of 4.2%. What we ended up with is 35,000 round figures, 700 jobs created, still pretty darn strong. Growth rate a little slower, 2.3. Unemployment down at 4.0. So if we look at how the economy is done, all these blue bars are growth. There's the Great Recession. And what you see going on here is for several years in a row, we've been adding jobs fairly aggressively. The biggest number, we added 64,000 in 2014. There's the 35,000 that I just talked about. We sit 19.1% above where we were before the recession when this particular year, 2020, started. When we talk about forecasts, an important number to realize in the Inland Empire is what we expect to happen to population growth. It is anticipated by the State Department of Finance that we're going to add another 1.46 million people out here. You'll notice that's almost double Los Angeles, and it is 400,000 more than Orange, San Diego, Imperial, and Ventura counties combined. So this is where the action is going to be long term. It'll take our population up to 6.1 million. Right now, our population sits at 3.66. So if you think it was crowded running around here recently, imagine another 1.5 million people almost. Now, looking ahead, clearly the key to the immediate year that we're in is the coronavirus. As of yesterday, San Bernardino had 2,182 people that had it. 97 have died. Riverside County, for some reason, almost doubled at 4,164, with 161 having passed away. Now, really important to my work is what's taken place with unemployment. The state has lost 3.7 million jobs. People have filed for unemployment insurance. In addition to that, both Congress and the Federal Reserve Bank have poured literally trillions of dollars into the economy with the idea of trying to keep it going and maybe even increasing where it goes. Now, this is the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total of all the stuff and services we create in a year in the United States. You will notice it had slowed down recently and at the end of 2019, and as 2020 starts, the gross domestic product is down 4%. That is the first shrinkage since the Great Recession. And it really, that's the first quarter, all 3 months combined. January was pretty good. February was faltering. And then March really started to dive. Obviously, April is going to be much worse. When we look at consumer spending in the US, and all of these figures affect us because these national numbers are the ocean our economy swims in. You will see here that consumer spending was slowing as the year went on last year. Now it's down 7.8%, which is a deep drop. Then we get to business investment spending. This is buying tools, buying equipment, getting new software installed. On here, what we see is it was already negative at the end of 2019, and it was down 15% in the first quarter this year. So not a good national environment. Then we look at the state. State of California honestly is a bit weird in that a state legislature dominated essentially by the Democratic Party has walked away from blue collar and middle income jobs, mostly because they're so concerned about the environment that logistics, which is trucking and warehousing, construction, which is occurring outside, and manufacturing, all three of those have been reduced. So you notice here, this blue, that's the share of the California economy that is blue collar, and it's only 22%. Then we have a little bit of clean work that pays moderately. Moderately, 45,000 to 62.5 is the median incomes in the sectors. Only 6.9, a total of less than 30% of the economy. This is not an accident. State policy, particularly in terms of hurting these blue-collar sectors, is what's driving this. Another negative that we're dealing with is housing prices. This is a chart of affordability. The red bar up here is affordability in the Inland Empire, 44%. Now, what does that mean? It means 44% of households can only afford, that's what share can afford, the bottom half of houses. So it is a very weak market because of prices being high. Then we get to San Diego, only 29%. And then we get to LA and Orange County, only 25%. Really, this ought to be called housing unaffordability, because what it's saying is 56, 71, and 75% of households in those markets cannot afford the bottom half of houses because prices have soared to such high levels. This is the California Environmental Quality Act and NIMBYism in action, both of which have reduced the production of housing and caused housing prices to soar. Another issue that we face in the economy this year, and for the Inland Empire and for California, it's pretty much perpetual, are electrical costs in this state. These are the electrical costs from Colorado to Washington, 7.13 cents a kilowatt hour down to 4.44 cents for the state of Washington. This is for industrial electricity. There's California, way out of line with all of our competitive Western states. What it says is if you're a company on, say, the East Coast, and you make propellers, which a friend of mine actually has a company back east doing, and you realize I have so many companies in California that want my propellers because there's a lot of recreational boating going on. So the guy drives this way and he stops in Arizona. He finds out that Arizona is 98.3% more expensive than California for industrial electricity. He whips up to Nevada, to Las Vegas, finds out we're 140% more expensive. For those kind of numbers, there's no way he's putting a plant in California. And again, this is policy. This is not accidents. This is largely because we've gone so far with the green agenda that we've priced ourselves out of the industrial market. Specifically for the Inland Empire, one of our difficulties is the educational attainment of our adults. What this chart shows you is 46.3% of Inland Empire adults 25 and over have stopped at high school or didn't go that far. You can see that's above LA, California, the rest of the state. Only the Central Valley is in worse shape than we are. And this is not improving, it got worse. The year before it was 45.7. We turn around and reverse this and look at people with AA degrees or higher. What do we see there? Inland Empire, 30.2%. Now, AA and higher is people that are Associate of Arts, so they've been at community college, bachelor's degree, master's, PhD, lawyers, CPAs. We're competing against all those other areas of California. And what it says is, particularly in the South, we can't compete. So if you get a company that needs a high-level labor force that decides they want to come here, they're going to have to import their labor from somewhere else. It was 29.8, so it's improved slightly, which is good news. Now, in January, I did a forecast of the economy. What did I say? We were going to add 28,150 jobs, which was a slow downward trend, but still pretty strong. The problem is that no longer is accurate because of COVID-19. So what sector should we carefully watch? Well, that was where we were going. but we're throwing that out. So let's take a look at data on March 2019 versus March 2020 this year. Logistics and distribution, that's the big firms that you see, the large buildings in the Inland Empire, up 11,800 despite all the problems in March. Healthcare, up 6,400. A strong sector, obviously, because we need a lot of healthcare. Then we have local government, higher education, and federal and state government, all of which pay well. Yellow on this pays really well. That's essentially around 75,000 plus. And those sectors grew a little. Then we have construction, only added 1,100 jobs. There's retail trade, barely moved. We know a lot of stores are closed. That's what that means. Then there's banks. Banks are still open. They added a few jobs, but you notice overwhelmingly it's two sectors. It's logistics and distribution, and it is healthcare. And then you have these sectors down here, all of which shrank. The biggest, eating and drinking. Obviously, the restaurants are closed. K through 12 education, the schools are closed. Amusement, we're not gathering together in large groups. Accommodation shrank, not seeing a lot of travel going on. So you see, these are the really important ones. These are a real problem. So now let's go through altogether. March, we didn't shrink. We were up 12,500 jobs in the Inland Empire. April will not look like that. And so as we go forward, we're going to see issues. Now, let's start with logistics. So this is the companies that are moving stuff in Southern California. Pay in the sector, 49.1. That's pretty darn good pay. Now, what drives this sector? First of all of us are buying online now. You can see that this was 0.6 of all sales back in 2000. It's now over 11.4% of all sales. And most recently, it grew before the COVID-19 hit. It was already growing at 16.7 year over year. So that's e-commerce. Now, looking at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, the way we measure cargo coming in through the ports of LA and Long Beach is in 20-foot equivalent containers. We call those TEUs. If you see a train with those big, long containers, that's 2 TEUs each. Those are 40 feet long. You can see here there was quite a buildup in container volumes to a peak at 8.2 million. That's the Chinese trade taking off. You then see the Great Recession. It goes down to 6.1 million, slowly builds up to a record of 9.0. So 9 million containers coming in. Then we have the president with his tariff policies. That took it from 9.0 down to 8.5. And now with the coronavirus hitting, we're down to 7.4 with the combination of the tariffs and the slowdown in international trade because of the virus. We were down 12.9% in the first quarter. It'll be down over 20 when we get through into the second quarter. Now, with those two drivers powering logistics in the Inland Empire, one of the things that we see is industrial space net absorption. Companies coming in and filling up warehouses with goods and employing workers to maintain them. This chart, every little square on it, represents 4 quarters. So the 4 quarters ended in March. 18.6 million square feet of space was absorbed by new company. Logistics sector growth, I had forecasted last year would be 9 million. It came in at 11.2. In March, it was up 11.8, as I showed you a little earlier. Now, what are the forces affecting this sector? 1, we're starting to run out of land. 2, port volumes are declining because of the international trade and tariffs, but e-commerce has been extraordinarily strong. So what do I expect? Well, in March it was up 11.8. I think for the whole year it'll average up about 8,000. So I think once we get into the downturn part of this, it'll slow it a little bit from where it was in March. Then there's healthcare, good paying sector, 65,757 a year at the median, half above, half below. This is driven by two things. One is the Affordable Care Act. If you go back to 2013, 19.4% of the people in the Inland Empire had no health insurance. It was 20.5% the year before that. It's now down to 8.4% because of Obamacare. Altogether, the drop from 877 to 382 was a drop of 56.5% of people with no health insurance. That has done two things. One, it's increased people's standard of living because they have health care. But the other thing that it's done is it's created a demand for healthcare workers. So you'll notice it has come up a bit, and the reason has been all of the attacks on Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, in the Congress and in the White House have not done us any services in that respect. The other thing driving this is the number of people each healthcare worker in the Inland Empire takes care of versus the state average. The state average is 25.4. Here in the Inland Empire, it's more people, 31.2. It's in fact 22.8% higher. So our healthcare workers are busier. Those drive the sector. I had forecasted last year we'd have 4,800. We in fact added 5,600. March, we were up 6,400 over March the previous year. So pretty strong. What are the forces driving this sector? One, we're running out of trained workers. Two, there is a stimulus package heading for hospitals, which is good news. So what did I forecast now? 7,000 for the year, because we really need a lot of people working in healthcare when you have a pandemic going on. Then moving on to construction. And this is all types of construction. Construction of homes, large buildings, office buildings, retail. What do we see here? Construction pay, half make more than 52.4, half make less. I said a while ago, we have a lot of firms moving in and taking industrial space, which is good news because it's adding jobs in that particular sector. The vacancy rate is all the way down at 3.8%. There's not a lot of space left. Look how high it used to be, over 22 at one point. Not only that, we're having to build a lot of space. So the vacancy is low despite we're building a lot all the time. We're building in March 21.2 million square feet of new industrial space. That's all that construction. That is 74.5% of all the space being created in Southern California. Who's second place? The answer is it's LA, but we're creating 5 times what LA County created. Then there's the housing market. What do we see here? The blue line shows you what's taking place with price trends. And what do we see? Prices went up to a peak of 437.2 before the Great Recession, crashed, and on up to 457,348. Those are new homes. New homes right now are 4.6% higher than before the Great Recession. The red line, what is that? That is existing homes. Peaked at 389, dropped all the way down to 155, but it's back to 370, though it is still 5.1% below the peak. But things have gotten a little bit pricey. You see here almost a straight line. That's as close to a straight line as you ever get on data on economics. And what's it say? It says home sales have been flat. They've fluctuated in a very narrow range quarter to quarter to quarter. Now, one of the more important charts that we have is why does the Inland Empire keep adding people? Here is the middle-priced house in San Bernardino County in the fourth quarter. There's Riverside, about $59,000 more expensive. And then there's San Diego, LA, and Orange, $632,000, $650,000, $812,000. What's that tell you? It's $280,000 saved if you come to San Bernardino County from San Diego, $298 if you come here from LA, and you save $460,000 on the average house moving into San Bernardino County from Orange County. Similar kinds of numbers in rentals. $1,562 is the average rent in the Inland Empire. That's about $400 less than San Diego, about $600 less than Orange County, and almost $800 less than LA County. So what's the forecast been in construction given what's going on in these various parts of it? Well, last year I forecasted 6,000 new construction jobs. What happened? It only came up 700. I was way off. March, we're up 1,100 year over year. What's the forces driving this? Difficulty in permitting lots, the Environmental Quality Act where people can stop projects, the very high prices in the housing market and the lack of supply. And then there's a shortage of construction workers pretty much across the board. So what have I forecasted now? I think it'll be a little better as we get towards the end of the year. So the whole year we're average up about 2,000 jobs. Related to this is finance, insurance, and real estate. This is the banks, the real estate companies, the insurance companies. I had forecasted they'd be up 1,200 last year. Again, I missed it. They declined 1,200. This year, they're up 700 year over year. The fact is, high prices drive this, lack of homes for sale, and low interest rates. What do I forecast now? I think it'll end up only 500 for the year. Then there are the high-paying sectors in the economy: biotechnology, engineering, law, accounting, sectors like that. Pay in those sectors, 72,436 is what the median is. I had forecasted last year 1,100, pretty close. It came up 13. Year over year, it's up 1,000. This is largely driven by the education gap between the Inland Empire and the coastal counties that we looked at earlier, showing much smaller number of people that have AA and higher degrees. The new forecast, 1,000 jobs. Then there is the sectors in real trouble. First of all, retail, trade, and consumer services. There's a part of the economy that we call population serving. It's all the jobs that directly take care of us, often one-on-one. So it's retail trade, as you see here, is Lowe's. It's hairstylists, consumer services. I had forecasted they'd drop 22.25. They actually dropped 33.50. This year so far, they were up 1,000. Here we have e-commerce attacking stores. We have a lack of available workers because a lot of people, when the unemployment rate got low, went to work in places like Amazon. And then now we have COVID-19 closing stores, closing down personal services. What do I forecast here? Negative 44,690, which is a decline of 20% by the time we get to the end of the year. The short term, it probably be larger than that. I think about 20% of who's was working there at the end of last year still won't be working at the end of this year. So that's one of the places we get clobbered. Then there's eating and drinking. As you know, you can't go to a restaurant unless you get something at the curb that they bring out to you. But sit-down meals are ended. I had forecasted 4,700 jobs in this sector last year. 4,500 were created. This year in March, it was already down to 3,900 restaurants. We're doing well going into the recession. Again, they have a lack of available workers because the income rate was strong. People's income were strong, so they were dining out. But COVID-19 has shut them down. So what's the revised forecast? Down 27,400. That's a 10% decline. And my anticipation is that it could be worse than that by the time we get to the end, get the next year. Finally and lastly, we have accommodation and amusement, hotels, skiing, going to the movies, those sorts of things. With the coronavirus, that isn't going to be going on, probably very little of any of this for this year. The sector pays 34,183 at the median. I had forecasted 700 jobs. This year, March over March, we were down 3,600. Now, the rationale, the incomes were strong. People were traveling, but COVID has shut down both travel as well as entertainment. So I think this will now be down 19,150, which is a 50% decline. If we add up the gains in sectors like logistics and healthcare, and the losses like the ones in accommodation and entertainment, retail, eating out, here's what's happened. I had originally forecasted we'd gain 28,150. Now I'm forecasting for the year we will average a loss of 72,340. Growth was forecasted at 1.8 with unemployment at 4.3. Now growth is forecasted at a negative 4.6 or an unemployment rate of 8.3%. Now this is my website address. I'm going to post this there. So if it's of use to anyone, please go there and you'll go to a section called PowerPoints and you can download it and hopefully it will help you in your businesses. Thanks for a lot to have the opportunity to speak with you, and be safe.
Well, I want to thank John Husing for agreeing to do that. Most of it was, as you see, focused on employment and what we can expect in 2020. What I'm going to play next for you is, and real quick, we will be posting that to cbcsymposium.com, also on Facebook. So if you want to replay John Husing's presentation, it'll be available for you. Lance Martin, Coldwell Banker Town and Country, holds a real estate and forecast each year. This year it was scheduled for the Fox Theater in Riverside, and he featured Chris Thornburg. He'd asked Chris Thornburg to actually do a presentation for the Coldwell Banker owners on the West Coast and for their agents. And what I'm going to play for you was recorded approximately 2 weeks ago, and it really dives into not just about the economy, but also housing and what we can expect. And I think you'll enjoy it as I did. So let me go ahead and cue that up for you.
Right. Okay, guys, we're getting there. Okay, so this is the deal. Most of you know Chris. If you haven't known Chris, Google him. I'm not going to go through his introduction. He's kind of a big deal, though. You know, I've been following Chris for years during the REO cycle and the REO market for years and years and years. That's how I got to know Chris, and he is just a wonderful guy. He's been speaking at my market forecast stuff forever, and he's basically done a couple of talks for me, most recently at our 2020 real estate market forecast, which is kind of cool. And yesterday, matter of fact, when we're done with this talk today, we're going to post a video that Chris did yesterday. He basically did a little bit of a mini debate with Manford Kyle from Claremont McKenna College. And we're going to go ahead and post that 2 minutes after this is over. We're also recording this session, and we'll go ahead and we'll post this as well. So again, Dr. Thornburg, he's the founding partner of Beacon Economics, as you can see on his slide there, and he's also the director for the Center of Economic Forecasting at UCR. So at any rate, Chris, I told you we tried to get you out here in 30 minutes. I've already added 8 minutes to your time, so I'm going to turn this over to you, and just fire away, my friend. And we will take some questions at the end. So just type your questions in the chat box. We'll try to figure out which ones are decent, and we'll throw them back to Chris when he's done. Go for it, Betty. Oh, and let me, hold on a minute. We need to unmute you.
I'm unmuted now.
There you go.
I did it myself. You good?
You're good to go. Go for it.
Okay, and you can see my screen?
We can.
This is very exciting. See, it does work, just takes a little time. It's kind of like dealing with a virus, which is, of course, where we're starting today. These are certainly interesting times. In fact, one would go so far as to say they are truly unprecedented in modern economic history. The question isn't the severity of the virus. We all appreciate that. But the question is what's going to happen with the economy? What are the economic implications for what's going on around us today? Now, to be clear, it's interesting because at the start of this year, everybody was actually feeling better. It's interesting. 2019 was a fairly bearish year. Lots of conversations about various sorts of stressors on the economy. A lot of folks were predicting a recession. And in February of this year, how ironic was that date? Of course, the Wall Street Journal released their next recession poll. And lo and behold, most of the economists who contributed to that poll have backed off their bearish predictions. And only 10% said we were going to have a recession in 2020. Now, of course, we were also relatively positive about the economy. This was a slide I was using back in February. But even then, I noted that the biggest risk to the economy is, of course, this coronavirus. And it was a wild card. We sure what was going on. There was a lot of different kinds of information out there, but no one really knew where this whole thing was going. So it happened. Worst case scenario. And I won't go into the numbers. We don't have time for that. Besides, you see enough of it. We're well over a couple million cases, well over 100,000 cases across the globe. And to combat this virus, there's been really almost across most nations who are dealing with this, there have been shelter-in-place rules. People are simply being asked, or in some cases being told, you have to stay home, you can't go to restaurants, you can't go to stores, you can't go to your work, you have to stay home. And of course, the big question that comes out of this is, what does this mean for the economy? Well, if you've been reading the news, the answer is, this is the end. I mean, everybody's talking about how we're already in a recession, and it's going to be a bad one. And you've heard all the bearish predictions. The IMF saying this is going to be the worst hit to the global economy since the Great Depression. The OECD tells us this is going to be felt for a long time to come. Financial markets are all over the place. Millions of people are applying for unemployment. You're talking about, in many cases, forecasts that suggest that this thing isn't going to get out of the system for 2 or maybe 3 years. Now, to be clear, no one really knows what's going to happen yet. Why? Because remember, forecasts rely on the past to help build a vision of the future. Well, we are in truly uncharted waters right now, not historically, but at least in the last 50 or 60 years. And thereby, we don't have a lot of history to go with. So there's an old expression, a good forecaster is not smarter than everybody else. He merely organizes his ignorance in a little better way. And what I'm hoping to do today is kind of break this down, break down what's happening, put some thought and logic around it, and then see where that leads us in terms of implications for where the economy is going. Now, how negative are some of these outlooks? Here's a couple I just grabbed, and there's lots of these out there. One of these on the left came from the Bank of America. On the right comes from UBS. But wow, these are pretty dramatically negative numbers. Take, for example, the Bank of America forecast. They're talking about a massive decline in economic activity in the second quarter and a further reduction in the third. And they're talking about not getting back to Q4 19 levels of output until the end of 2021. That is a truly scary downturn. On the right-hand side is unemployment rates. And for UBS, they're talking about unemployment rates remaining at elevated levels through 2021 and only getting back to the current levels really at the end of 2022, a 2.5-year labor cycle. These are scary numbers. And I kind of understand why everybody's getting a little bit freaked out. Really, the only bit of data we have at this point in time are initial claims for unemployment. And those are truly startling. If you look at past recessions, so 75, early 80s, even the Great Recession, you can see that the insured unemployment rate got not ever all that high. Now, some of this has to do with who is and who isn't eligible for unemployment insurance. But as you can see, this time around, the numbers are just off the charts. They're nothing like what we've seen in the past. And that is true in terms of the overall scale. But let's keep something else in mind. If you look at the past, one of the things you'll immediately note is that employment is a lagging indicator. Indeed, it's interesting to note that insured claims for unemployment peaked at the end of the Great Recession, not the beginning. And by the way, that's true for every past cycle. And that's because businesses only lay off people as a last case option. Laying off people and then afterwards having to hire people is an enormously expensive process. And businesses go out of their way to do everything but have to deal with that until they absolutely have to. And as such, employment lags the rest of the economy. It happens long after everything else does. But this time, while these numbers are truly startling, it doesn't fit at all the patterns of the past. It doesn't look anything like these past downturns. And that's very important. You cannot look at these initial claims and say, oh, this tells me exactly what it told me during the Great Recession. It does not. Now, to go to the next step, we also have to remember something else. I understand there's a lot of scary headlines out there, but then ask yourself, over the last decade, when haven't there been a lot of scary headlines? In fact, when it comes to economic conversations, I think we can kind of agree that hysteria is the new normal. I have to remind everybody that the same group of people screaming at us that this is going to be a depression-type economic cycle caused by this virus were largely the same people in January of last year, in 2019, who were explaining that the markets were down 20% because interest rates are rising, inflation was on the rise, the real estate markets were already crashing, and by the way, the trade war with China was going to demolish U.S. manufacturing. Of course, none of those things happened in 2019. And while this is by far and away the most severe negative shock to hit the U.S. economy in the last decade, I would simply point out that the degree of hysteria in the conversation has equivalently risen to new high levels of extreme hyperbolic predictions. You got to put this to one side, and shrieking headlines are just clickbait. They're just trying to get you to pay attention to them. Now let's take a little step back to understand the weirdness of where we are today and compare it to the past. Let's talk about what a recession is in the first place. Everybody has to remember that that growth is the default mode of any economy. No politician has ever created a growing economy, and no politician has ever rescued an economy. Growth is the default mode. And that's because there is no the economy. Rather, there are millions of people who go out and they bust their butts on a day-to-day basis to do better for themselves, for their families, and their companies, period. Now, every once in a while, those people are prevented from doing what they want to do. The system doesn't work. Things fall into equilibrium. And that's driven by a negative shock to the system. Now, to be clear, there are always negative shocks to the system. Some sectors rise, which cause other sectors to fall. Small things happen here. Negative shocks happen there. We're constantly beset by setbacks along the way. But for the most part, this big organic system called the economy can handle it. People adapt, things morph, people move jobs, and we continue to grow. But every once in a while, there is a shock that truly sets the system into turmoil and creates a negative feedback loop by which you cause a decline in aggregate demand, which causes people to be laid off, which means they spend less, which causes a bigger decrease in aggregate demand, and so on and so forth. And that shock and feedback effect creates enough disequilibrium that the economy no longer grows. Instead, it actually contracts for a period of time before it starts to heal. Now, what kind of shock creates this sort of situation? Well, the answer is a shock to the system that has to have three characteristics. It's got to be very large, it's got to be very rapid, and it has to be sustained. And sustain is a critical issue here because it's the sustained part that causes businesses to finally lay off people. Now, this is the big question about where we are. Look, if you go back and say this is going to be as bad as the Great Recession, then let's first talk about what created the Great Recession and see if that even smells the tiniest bit right. The Great Recession, by the way, was set off by, of course, what happened in the preceding 6 years. 6 years in which between 2001 and 2007, there was $15 trillion of new consumer and financial sector debt. And this was all wrapped around, of course, the subprime revolution, a revolution that allowed people to borrow with zero underwriting. And somehow or other, Wall Street claimed they had a magic system to turn that into gold-plated securities. Turns out it was one of the greatest frauds in history. Now, what happened in the meantime is what caused the Great Recession. While they were pumping all that money into the consumer sector, we saw huge imbalances start to form in housing and borrowing and consumers, and of course, consumer spending. Housing, because of course, as money flowed into subprime mortgages, home production was vastly too high. We saw enormous amounts of borrowing, enormous amounts of price increases, and people took all that equity and borrowing to heart, and you saw savings rates drop to a very scare low level. In other words, in 2006, while growth might have felt good, it was clearly rotten to the core. Now, mind you, the Great Recession didn't happen overnight. It took a while for it to kick in. Everything really started to fall apart in late 06, early 07, and it took a full year for the collapsing housing market and subprime lending market to finally catch up with the rest of the economy and build up to a big enough shock to the system that everything started to fall apart. Now, it was nasty. Millions of jobs were lost in construction, finance, and retail sales, lost permanently because that subprime bubble collapsed and it wasn't coming back. And then there were a bunch of secondary job losses. It was a 6-quarter downturn where the economy contracted by almost 6% in real terms. And by the way, we didn't get back to normal levels of economic activity until 2015. It was one nasty cycle. It was a big deal. Now, how about today? Well, first of all, let's take a step back. There is no subprime bubble that's collapsing as far as we can tell. As far as I know, I don't see anything that seems as if we have hyperextended parts of the economy, such as housing and consumer spending. Only thing we have right now is a bunch of job losses driven not by an economic shock to the system, but by public health mandates. Yes, a lot of people are not working right now, but to be perfectly clear, the reason they're not working is not because their businesses have gone bankrupt because there's no demand for their services, but because their clients are prevented from buying their services because of the public health mandates. That is an enormous deal. Look, we can all agree that if we came up with a cure for this virus tomorrow, everybody would almost assuredly go back to the work the day after that. In other words, these aren't permanent job losses, the way the job losses running up and into the Great Recession were truly permanent. There is no reason to anticipate a major structural destruction of the economy. There just isn't. Now, it isn't to say this is harmless. Of course, there's harm being created here. But the kind of harm being created is a harm that's driven right now as the economy is shut down. People aren't earning money. Businesses aren't earning profits. And obviously, the longer that goes, the more true long-run harm builds up in the system. But we don't know how much harm is actually going to occur. We don't. And for anybody to sit out there and say they know how this is going to shake out and this is going to be tremendously bad, when candidly we're completely operating in the dark, well, I find that to be something between, well, either completely intellectually dishonest or candidly, simply disingenuous. Now, we don't know where this is going, but there are plenty of potential scenarios. And you could argue it could be, as everybody's saying, a big, nasty shock. And to think about this, let's just kind of run through this. We know, of course, the economy's been growing fine. At some point in the future, it will grow fine again. What's going to happen between now and then after this large negative shock driven by these public health mandates? Well, one, of course, outlook is the Great Recession. where the harm to the system stays in the system and we have this long, slow, painful recovery, a grace recession type scenario. Another argument would be actually, this is pretty short and quick. It's a downtick and then we immediately bounce back up again, right? I mean, why would it be such a long downturn? Where's the major reorganization of the economy? And then, by the way, there's even a third scenario that people aren't even talking about at all. That's a natural disaster type scenario. Look, if you think about, say, when Miami-Dade slammed when Miami-Dade was hammered by Hurricane Andrew back in the day, you're talking about a major wipeout of a major metropolitan economy. But guess what? They weren't down and out for years. They had a really nasty down quarter because for 2 months they were cleaning and fixing and trying to get their basic infrastructure of their city back up and running. But you know what? The quarter after that, everybody went crazy and everybody went out and partied and the tourists came back and you saw a surge in economic activity before you got back to normal levels of output. Is it going to be a great recession, a mild recession, or perhaps just a big bounce? We don't know. And that's the critical issue. Everybody's assuming the worst case. I don't think they're right. Why? Because the way to think about this is to ask 4 basic questions. A, how long, how deep is the shutdown? We don't have that information, but we have some guiding principles. 2, how healthy was the economy prior to the pandemic? Is this simply setting off a cascade event within the midst of a historically weak economy? Or is this a strong economy that's well balanced, thus can deal with the hit? Number 3, what is the government doing in the meantime? Fiscal policy matters, people, and you got to bring that in to think about the predictions. And last but not least, long run effects. Are there true issues with how consumers are going to come back if they come back at all? Well, let's go through these step by step. First of all, let's talk about the how deep. Now, a lot of folks are giving you a lot of scary numbers, but again, we don't have much in the way of information. We only have data on retail sales and industrial production for March, just in the last few days. And those numbers, by the way, don't look all that bad. Retail sales, by the way, in the first quarter of this year are only off about 2.3%. That's not a very big number when you think about it. And that's, of course, because this really only happened in the second half of March. Industrial production also fell a little bit. But again, the numbers aren't all that scary. Indeed, when you look at Q1, it doesn't seem like it's going to be very negative at all. And about a 0% would seem logical. And indeed, if you take a look at the Atlanta Fed numbers, you got to remember the shock hit the system at the back end of Q1. And while everybody's talking about a -4, -5, -6% first quarter, I don't know how that happens when 75, 80% of the Q1 was already in place when we actually started shutting everything down. Now, the current numbers through the end of last month suggest about 0%. That's plus or minus 0.5%. There's a couple big numbers out there on trade and inventories we all have to look at before we can really come up with anything. But it probably isn't going to be all that bad of a quarter. Now, the second quarter, on the other hand, no doubt that's going to be gory. Probably be the worst quarter ever because, of course, mandates are simply not allowing certain parts of our economy to operate. They're just not. Now, what kind of numbers are we talking about? Again, no one really knows because we don't have a lot of ways of scaling this. But I think a good steady number would be about -30%. Now, that sounds like a really scary number. But remember, economists have this annoying habit of actually presenting everything in annualized form. What that really means is about a 7.5% decline in economic output in the second quarter of the year. Still historically bad, but not that bad. You're still talking about the vast majority of the economy still operating and moving forward. So take a deep breath. The whole world hasn't come to an end, despite the fact that sometimes it feels like it when you're listening to the news. But the real question is, how long is this going to go for, right? Because we get it, how deep it is. How long? Well, yet again, we do have some information on this because public health data is coming out a lot faster than economic data. For example, if you look at China right now, China, of course, which is almost 3 months into this, and they've really gotten over the number of new cases. Italy's over the hump, Spain's over the hump. In fact, most of Europe is over the hump at this point in time. And yes, even the United States is starting to get there as well. Now, what about economic activity wrapped around this? Well, again, we don't have a lot of information, but because China's ahead of the game, that's the best place to look. And this is the data that came from Goldman Sachs. They have some high frequency data on China, but man, I would love to get my hands on. But I don't have Goldman Sachs pockets. But I do get their PDFs. I'm fortunate to do that, so I will present this data. And on the left, you can see their industrial activity tracker. This is day-to-day stuff based on trucks and coal consumption stuff. And by the way, they're actually back to where they were. So about 3 months for the industrial part of the economy to get back up and running. On the other side, consumer spending. A little bit of a longer slog, but they are getting back to normal slowly but surely. If you did a basic linear trend, you're talking about a little over 4 months to get back to normal. In other words, okay, 3 to 4 months. Now, yet again, when you think about the United States, we have also peaked. All the data suggests that we are, of course, on the other side of this. Things are starting to subside. And if we ride that kind of curve down, and you think about the numbers coming out of China, 3 to 4 months, what you're really talking about here is Q3 more or less being when we reopen. This quarter, we'll probably see some partial reopenings with limitations here and there, which will help mitigate some of the hits we're feeling right now. But again, all the numbers suggest everything should more or less get back to normal levels of activity once we get into the third quarter of this year, but for any kind of damage that may occur in the meantime. So it doesn't seem like this thing's going to go on a long time. Now, there are some, of course, issues here. For example, we do have to worry about the idea of some sort of second resurgence. We'll just have to play that by ear at this point in time. How healthy was the economy at the beginning of this? Well, yet again, all the data says we were not a fragile economy. Now, again, that's not the headline. Every headline says this is an insanely fragile economy. It's like a piece of delicate crystal. Any little tap will cause it to fall apart. And actually, no. This economy has been kind of moving forward at a steady, strong, not the fastest, most exciting, but nevertheless stubbornly persistent pace. We've taken shocks before, whether it was the Chinese trade war or the massive commodity bust that occurred back in 14 and 15. And we kind of weathered it without any sort of problem at all. We are a fundamentally healthy economy. Savings rates, for example, for households, those, by the way, are back up to 8%. That's the last time they've been at this level sustained was back in the early 1990s. Very good numbers here. On the right-hand side, wage gains for Americans. This is from the Atlanta Fed wage tracker, which is, by the way, good data, unlike the stuff that comes out of the BLS monthly, which is no good. And the economist who cites the wage numbers from the monthly labor report should lose their economist license if there is such a thing. But the real data actually suggests that average wage growth has been 4%, median 2% in real terms. A financial obligations ratio, the percent of household income used on debt and various sorts of obligations, that's near a record low level right now because of slow pace of debt accumulation and, of course, lower interest rates. Well, that may be true for the top 1%. Actually, it's true for everybody. On the left-hand side is ratio of debt payments to family income for different levels of income within the U.S. economy. This comes from the best data we have, the Survey of Consumer Finances from the Federal Reserve. And it doesn't paint anything like a financially fragile consumer sector for every level of the economy. Not only are median payments down in every income category, down from where they were in 07, they're lower than they were back in 1998. Again, this is not a financially delicate consumer sector. As for job growth, it has been slowing, but that's only because the unemployment rate's been at 3.5%, a 50-year low level. And while some businesses may not come out of this, let's remember that those workers who are let go are going to be re-entering a labor market that for 2 years has been suffering from labor shortages. Now, again, you don't hear that in the headlines, but that's what we've been dealing with. Labor shortage issues across the United States. Right now, well, at least according to the most recent data, the number of job openings in the United States has been greater than the number of people looking for work, greater than. And by the way, that's been true for over 2 years running. This is a solid economy. How about real estate? Well, again, a very similar sort of picture. I heard Moody's come out with some forecast suggesting you could see 15% of homeowners go belly up, as bad as through the Great Recession. That's just not reasonable. Right off the bat, even if you thought this was gonna be as bad as the Great Recession, it's not going to have that kind of impact on the housing markets. The impact on the housing markets back then didn't come from the shock from the Great Recession. Housing wasn't a byproduct of the Great Recession. Housing drove the Great Recession because it was so inflated in the first place. This time around, our housing markets are vastly more healthy than they were back then. There is no excess supply of units. For 10 years, as opposed to being in the midst of a subprime borrowing glut, instead, Dodd-Frank, because there's really limited borrowing, to really some of the best credit-worthy households. Over the last decade, median credit scores for mortgage borrowing has been above 750. Today, the equity share in the real estate market is near an all-time high level. And by the way, this isn't driven by massive price increases. This is driven by simply a slow pace of mortgage borrowing. The cost of borrowing. You know, we keep hearing how expensive housing is. Actually, according to the American Community Survey, housing is the cheapest it's been in the last decade, both for renters and owners, once you look at housing costs as a percent of income. The share of those who are non-housing cost constrained going up, those who are housing cost constrained going down, and that trend's been consistent again for 10 years, not a fragile housing market. As for the financial sector overall, again, the screams of dismay and decline coming out of the hedge fund industry would be almost humorous if people weren't taking them so seriously. Look, no, we don't have a major debt problem in the United States. Private sector debt's been falling, again, for any number of years. Consumer debt's down. Financial sector down, debt is down. The only place you've seen that debt continue to grow as a percent of GDP is for non-financial corporate business, which, by the way, isn't even a lot of the debt out there. But hey, someone's got to make something about something, so they're going to keep keying on that and telling us how bad that's going to be. Well, actually, it's not that bad, because while it is true, non-financial corporate debt is high, so is non-financial corporate profits. And oh, by the way, once you consider low interest rates, it turns out the debt obligations for the non-financial corporate sector are actually very, very good. No major problems there. No major problems at all. And of course, remember, the delinquencies that started creeping into the financial system that eventually led to the massive meltdown in financial markets, those delinquencies back then started in 2006, a year before the recession hit. It takes a long time for these things to work their way through the credit markets. Right now, we don't have any problems in the credit markets. In fact, if you look at bank delinquencies for any variety of loans, they're at all-time record low level for commercial real estate, regular real estate, consumer loans. This is a pretty solid financial market. Now, what about government policy? Again, holy cow. When you think about the Great Recession, for the first half of 2008, people were arguing even if we were in a recession. Turns out we were. And of course, by the time we started thinking about what to do about it, that didn't happen until the end of 2008. And in fact, we didn't get any substantial policies in place in the early 2009. They started a year late, and even then, the efforts they made weren't all that good. This time around, well, aren't we fortunate that we're aware of the shock to the system before an election? Because when there's an election coming up, everybody opens up the spending faucet like nobody's business. And this is truly astonishing. You know, we live in a $22 trillion economy, which means every quarter there's about $5.5 trillion worth of economic transactions going on. $5.5 trillion. Now, we currently have a $2.5 trillion stimulus plan. $2.5 trillion spending plan in a quarter where you have $5.5 trillion worth of economic activity. Wow. I mean, that's crazy. That's a huge number. Hey, you can't just ignore that. And of course, you know all these about payments to households, payments to workers, payments to businesses, payments to small business, local government support. It's not just the federal government. The Fed's getting into play. Rate cuts, a few full-out quantitative easing effort. Local other institutions, the IRS, you don't have to pay your taxes. States, you don't have to pay your taxes. There's no evictions going on right now. Large landlords are simply giving rent deferrals to everybody up front. Large public mortgage lenders allowing owners to defer mortgages. Food programs are expanding. Have we ever seen this kind of massive intervention in such a short run? Never. So again, This goes a long way towards keeping things from getting out of hand while we're being shut down. So when you add it up, go through that with the list. How long? How deep? Well, it's not that deep, maybe 7.5%, 8% of the economy. How long? We'll be out of this by the third quarter. How good was the economy? Pretty darn good. What is the government doing? Everything. Why would this be a bad downturn? There's no reason, absolutely no reason whatsoever. Just not. So why are the stock markets going crazy? Well, for the same reason they went crazy a year and a half ago. Again, 20% declines in Q1 of 2019. By the way, that was the 6th major sell-off in the stock market since the Great Recession came to an end. This is now the 7th. Remember, hysteria is the new normal. And that is a real problem. You know, we need to take one lesson away from this. You know, in the past, when the stock markets have been freaking out, when the financial markets have been freaking out, I kind of laugh at it because I know everything's okay. This time, they freaked out to the point where they actually threatened to create a crisis in their own right. No virus, had the financial markets been allowed to melt down the way they were, we would have created one really out of thin air. Folks, the financial system is supposed to be the shock absorber of the US economy. When bad things happen, they're supposed to be our protection, our bulletproof armor. They haven't turned into that. Quite the opposite. Our financial markets are now shock accelerators. They're making things worse, not better. And that's because the markets have become unhinged. It's becoming a vast gambling game where, candidly, GQ Public is the mark at the table with all the professional gamblers. I hope at some point in time regulators wake up to what's going on. This volatility is not normal, it's not healthy, it's not sustainable, and they need to get into why the system is so badly broken and stop this from happening to yet again turn in our financial markets to what they were supposed to be, our protection. So, wrapping it all up, it's not that bad. Back then, millions of jobs lost permanently. Right now, people losing their jobs for 2 months, maybe 2.5 months. Back then, people had no idea what they were going to do next. Right now, the vast majority of these laid off people know exactly what they're going to do next. In 6 weeks, they're going to be working at the job they worked at 6 weeks ago. It's not the same thing. Back then, the financial system was pushed to the edge of insolvency because of the massive quantity of bad debt that built up in the system. This time around, there is no mountain of bad debt out there to screw up the system. It's just not the same thing. Now, again, there's no doubt there's going to be a little bit of pain out there, and this isn't going to go away completely quietly. But with massive government intervention, the idea that this thing is going to turn into a Great Recession type situation, it makes no sense whatsoever. So a couple basic thoughts here. First of all, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. Yes, maybe they overdid it with the public health warnings. Maybe the stay in place stuff was a little over dramatic. But you know what? It worked. It wasn't about flattening the curve, people. It was about getting rid of the curve. Had you let this thing get out of hand, if we had another massive second round, it would have been really ugly and a lot of people would have died. The cure is not worse than the disease here, not with everything else that's going on. Second thing to think about is, yet again, that government stimulus. Look, I'm glad they're getting into the mix, but let's all take a step back and also recognize there is still cost-benefit analysis. Hey, Congress, give us everything. It's free money. It's not free money. This is borrowing. And to put this in context, we already had a fiscal crisis on our hand. A long-run one, because we all know that somewhere around 2030 to 2032, we're going to have a fiscal crisis because Medicare and Social Security is going to crash the federal government. Oh, by the way, we have a short-run fiscal crisis too, because despite the fact that we're in the 10th year of 11th year of a major economic expansion and one of the most fundamentally healthy economies we've ever seen, our government was still going to borrow $1 trillion this year. Oh yeah, now they're going to borrow $2.5 trillion more. $3.5 trillion of borrowing in one fiscal year. As a percent of GDP, largest ever. Larger than during the Great Recession, larger, believe it or not, than during World War II, when we were fighting a major global war. Wow. You know, this is scary stuff, folks, and it's only a matter of time before this comes back to haunt us. So let's pay attention to that too. So what's my outlook? Where are we at? Well, Q1, 0% plus or minus 2%. Q2, 30% negative, plus or minus 10%. Big, nasty number, worst we ever saw. Q3, however, 25% up. Almost complete bounce back. Not complete, will be some residual damage, but pretty much complete. And by the way, that'll be the best quarter for growth we've ever seen. Now, by the way, is that a recession? Some people call a recession 2 quarters of negative growth. We may not have that. Other folks say, well, it's a protracted period of economic disturbance. Yet again, is 3 months protracted? Hard to say. It's an academic debate. Clearly, it's a big deal, but I don't know. Doesn't seem to be anything like the Great Recession. Yes, there's going to be some moderate upticks in debt distress. Stock market's all over the map, but I don't see any major reason to think this is going to have any impact on long-run investments, whether we're talking housing or commercial real estate or venture capital and various sorts of investments like that. Again, why would it? Look, this thing is here, it's going to be gone. The long run is much different than the short run. Now, there's a lot of wild cards here. It could be a second round of outbreaks. Viruses they're uncanny things. They mutate, they change, they shift. We got to pay attention to it. Now, again, as much as I know that we'll come back at some level, I can also tell you this. Remember, a little return to the virus is not that big of a deal because now we get it. Now we have testing. Now we understand what's going on. They got the surprise attack once. We sat around obliviously through February when this thing was creeping into our system. This time around, it's not going to happen. We'll see. Number 2, yes, there's going to be some pain coming out of industries primarily that were already distressed in the first place. Some retail, some restaurants are not going to reopen, not because the virus killed them, but rather to hasten the death that was already in play. These sectors are under stress. There's too many restaurants and retail is getting hammered by the internet. This is just pushing forward some wave of the closures that were already going to happen. Can the financial crisis create its own crisis? I don't think so. But man, I hope we pay attention to make sure this doesn't happen again. And last but not least, will consumers go back to normal behavior? Now, this one's complete speculation, right? Because we don't really know. But one of the things, yet again, that makes me a little crazy, and if you could tell, a lot of things make me a little crazy. This is not a new normal. It's not. Oh, it's a new normal. No, it's not a new normal. It's a new normal for our generation because we've been fortunate to live the last 40 to 45 years in a largely pandemic-free world because of modern medicine. But no longer. We've learned the hard way that turns out it's not completely pandemic-free. We still have to be a little bit cognizant of things. Now, by the way, prior to 40 years ago, epidemics, pandemics happened all the time. Nothing new about that. Nothing new at all. And, when you think about that, well, 50 years ago, 60 years, 70 years ago, when it was polio or the Spanish flu or measles or the mumps, when these things happen, or smallpox, when these things happen, did people stop going out? Did they stop congregating? Did they stop being social? No, they dealt with it. And then when the pandemic was gone, they went back to business. And you know what? I'd like to think we're as tough as they were. I really would. I don't think this is going to have a dramatic impact on us. I do think we'll get back to normal. We may wash our hands a little bit more and shake hands a little less. So be it. It's not going to hurt the economy. So if you couldn't tell, I'm largely positive on things. I don't think it's all that bad. I think we're going to bounce back quick. And I think the preposterous, hyperbolic, hysteric, negative outlooks, well, are just that. Don't let it get in your head. Think about this logically. And you start to realize this may be a nice lesson for us. Because this thing had truly been as dangerous as Ebola, as dangerous as SARS or MERS. This could have been much, much uglier than it is. Let's learn the lesson. Let's get through this, get this thing under control and move on. Now, last thing. A forecaster is an expert who will know tomorrow whether the things he predicted yesterday didn't happen today. We'll see. I appreciate the uncertainty out there, but I think there's a good case to be made for a very strong V. And all those folks out there saying this is going to be a U for sure, well, I'm pretty sure you're wrong. And I know you're being highly, highly irresponsible by giving people only the gloomiest potential outcome of the current situation we're in. Thank you very much, Lance. I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Chris Thornburg gave an excellent presentation. And if you have any questions or want to replay it, reach out to us. Next week, we have Brightline giving us an update regarding the high-speed train between Apple Valley and Las Vegas. You can register for that at cbcsymposium.com, and it's going to be next Thursday at 9 a.m. Until then, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.